Hello, welcome to our webinar on alternative fuels and policies to lower their carbon intensity, brought to you by CIFER, the Council on Food, Agricultural and Resource Economics. My name is Gal Hochman and I'm CIFER Board Chair and Professor at Rutgers University. It is my pleasure to be moderating today's webinar. Next. It's CIFER's mission to translate high-level research and knowledge to a diverse audience that includes policymakers, elected officials, and federal administrators. When we demonstrate the value of the profession to these groups, the Council increases public appreciation for research, extension, outreach, and academic programs in agriculture and applied economics. Next. Before we get started, I'd like to offer a few words of background on today's topic. Today, we'll delve into the policies to increase the climate benefits of biofuels and sustainable aviation fuels and contribute to rural communities' economic viabilities. We will also discuss the opportunities for increasing the climate benefit of these fuels and the effectiveness of using carbon intensity score-based policies to induce the adoption of climate-smart practices. We will also discuss the opportunities and challenges for such policies, and the webinar will also cover current policy landscape supporting biofuels and sustainable aviation fuels. Next. We have assembled today a panel of experts to discuss their work, starting with Jeff O'Hara, who is a Deputy Director in the Office of Energy Policy and New Uses within USDA's Office of the Chief Economist. Jeff studies incentives and trends in the implementation of climate-smart practices on U.S. farms and ranches. Prior to joining USDA's Office of the Chief Economist in 2021, Jeff was an economist at USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and the Chicago Climate Exchange. Next. Dr. Madhu Khanna is the ACES Distinguished Professor of Environmental Economics in the Department of Agricultural and Consumer Economics and Alvin H. Baum Family Chair and Director of the Institute for Sustainability, Energy, and Environment. At the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, she received her PhD from the University of California. Next. Kathy Bergen is Director for Federal Government Relations for Gevo Incorporation, where she manages day-to-day operations to shape federal policy outcomes. Prior to joining Gevo in 2023, Bergen led biofuels advocacy for the National Corn Growers Association as Director of Public Policy for Renewable Fuels for 6 years, representing the nation's corn farmers and NCGA's affiliated state organizations. Next slide, please. Before we start, we just wanted to explain how to ask questions, and we do ask and highly encourage you to ask questions and raise any queries you are interested in further discussing and understanding. During the webinar, to make sure that you, the audience, know how to engage, we wanted to illustrate this in the following slide. During the webinar, you can put questions to one or all of the speakers by typing it into the box in the control display, accessed by clicking on the question drop-down, as shown on the slides, and sending it to the organizer. And with that, we will now start our webinar. Next, please. And I'll hand the webinar over to Jeff, who will start us off. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Colin, to CIFER for inviting me here. This is a really exciting topic, and appreciate CIFER is elevating it and increasing the visibility of it, because it's a really big priority here for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And really what I'm going to talk about are biofuel regulatory programs and how they might provide incentives for climate smart farming practices that reduce the greenhouse gas impacts from farms and ranches. Next slide, please. So to begin, I just want to talk about this concept of what we mean when we say the carbon intensity of a fuel. So this concept of a carbon intensity of a fuel is sort of really critical in clean transportation fuel policies. And it refers to the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of the fuel relative to the amount of energy used. So it would be measured in something like, in our context, it's measured in grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule. And the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions for crop-based biofuels have several different components. There's both what people typically refer to as direct emissions and also indirect emissions. So direct emissions, a big source of that is producing the feedstock for the fuel. That includes production of, these are sort of like upstream emissions of production of fertilizer and soil amendments. There's also greenhouse gas emissions in the form of N2O emissions from fertilizer application. There's also can be greenhouse gas emissions from energy use on farms, like using tractors as an example. There's also other forms of direct emissions. This can occur from the transportation of crops to refineries, and then to fueling, and then biofuels to fueling stations, and then refining also generates emissions as well. There's also a whole other issue of a whole other type of emission associated with producing biofuels that are called indirect emissions, and just conceptually, the idea behind these is that they're market-mediated effects. So that, if a lot of corn in the U.S., as an example, started going from livestock feed into biofuel production, we might see this big drop in exports. And because there's a drop in exports, from the U.S., we might see corn production increase elsewhere in the world, and then there could be conversion of land into cropland, and then there's greenhouse gas emissions associated with that. And there could be other types of intermediate market effects from biofuel policies as well. So those types of greenhouse gas emissions are typically called indirect effects. Next slide, please. So what does this have to do with farming? So, promoting climate smart farming practices on U.S. farms has become a really big priority recently, as the U.S. has re-engaged with the Paris Agreement. They're looking to make a significant cut in greenhouse gas emissions from the U.S. agricultural sector as part of that. There's also been, a global methane pledge that we've taken a part of, and other sort of complementary initiatives around, reducing the greenhouse gas footprint from farms and ranches. And this can occur from certain types of farming practices. So conservation tillage is a practice that, unlike conventional tillage, when you don't till the soil, then there's this soil carbon that otherwise would have escaped that does not escape. Cover crops are, being looked at as a really important climate smart practice. So this, adding a cover crop, can provide additional biomass, which can increase soil carbon levels. The biggest form of greenhouse gas emissions from U.S. agriculture comes from N2O emissions. A big source of that is from fertilizer application. So there's ways that can be reduced. So enhanced efficiency fertilizers are, as the name implies, can use fertilizer more efficiently, which can reduce N2O emissions. And then there's just, what are typically called the 4 R's of nutrient management, which is the right, rate, source, timing, and placement. So if farmers apply fertilizer and following these guidelines, that can also be something that reduces N2O emissions. So in concept, the idea that if we want to reduce the greenhouse gas footprint of transportation fuels, we could also reduce the greenhouse gas footprint of agriculture. So in concept, those two things you'd think would work together. It's surprisingly the case that right now biofuel policies aren't set up for that. And so they don't provide this comprehensive way of reducing the greenhouse gas impacts of transportation fuels via a smaller greenhouse gas footprint in agriculture. And we'll talk about why that is here in a moment. Next slide, please. So just, kind of reiterating that the importance of climate smart farming, at least from what U.S. Department of Agriculture is doing. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture has existing conservation programs that it supports. It's went through a process of defining which practices within its conservation programs have greenhouse gas benefits. Historically, USDA conservation programs have not been operated to maximize greenhouse gas benefit mitigation. They've typically been operated as a way to improve soil or water quality. So now I think there's been a new focus on those conservation programs and practice standards for greenhouse gas impacts. This has been accelerated or amplified by a significant investment that came from the Inflation Reduction Act of over $19 billion in funding to the USDA to implement through its conservation programs for climate smart practices. There was also an additional $300 million provided for monitoring, measuring, reporting, and verifying the impacts. Also in 2022, the United States Department of Agriculture stood up a brand new program called Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities. And this is a grant program that was developed by USDA to create markets for climate smart commodities. We haven't seen those markets take off here in the US. I think developing new markets for small and medium-sized farms and ranches is consistent with USDA's mission. And so, creating these markets for climate smart commodities is really a next step and something that USDA can support with that grant program. And finally is just supporting sort of offset and biofuel markets in general. The USDA released a Growing Climate Solutions Act report last month in response to questions about how it could facilitate offset markets. And we're also providing technical support on some of the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits that I'll talk about here, in the context of climate smart farming. Next slide, please. So just, getting back to our partnerships program, I think there's a lot of exciting grants that we've given out there, and that have many of which have relevance for biofuel sector. I think we're going to hear about GEVOs here in a minute, so I won't say too much there. Otherwise, to note that there's several though that have relevance for biofuels, including one, a Climate Smart Camelina grant. We have Roslyn Alternative Energy, which is a RNG and renewable natural gas grant for using cellulosic feedstocks. They're not even really using manure. The National Sorghum Producers has an ethanol grant, and we also have ADM as well. So there's definitely a number of participants in the biofuel space that are going to be developing significant investments and significant supply chains for climate smart commodities to reduce the greenhouse gas impacts of biofuels. And so it's important for the regulatory programs to sort of be aligned with how these grant programs are working. Next slide, please. So the big national level biofuels policy in the US is the Renewable Fuel Standard, which is administered by the EPA. And just the overall structure of how the RFS works is that biofuels are grouped by category, and then there's volumetric requirements. There is a carbon intensity threshold that these biofuels need to maintain to sort of be eligible. So for corn ethanol, it's supposed to have a 20% greenhouse gas carbon intensity reduction vis-a-vis this petroleum baseline. And these reductions are higher for advanced biofuels like biodiesel and cellulosic biofuels. Still, if these thresholds are attained, then there actually are not strong incentives within the RFS to reduce biofuel production by amounts greater than those thresholds. So that's one of the limitations of the RFS. Next slide, please. We've also seen some states in the US adopt a different type of biofuel program. And California has the most prominent one called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. And so rather than establishing the volumetric mix of biofuels, what these programs do is they establish a carbon intensity standard. And then the carbon intensity score is going to decline over time. So the mix of fuels is going to be driven by the market, not by sort of volumetric mandates. And so if you produce a fuel that generates that with the CI score below the program standard, you're going to generate credits that you can sell. And then vice versa, if the carbon intensity of your fuel is too high, then you're going to generate deficits and have to buy credits. So these programs exist in California and Oregon. A brand new program in Washington just came online this year, and then they're being looked at as well in the Midwest. So in concept, feedstock emissions for crop-based biofuels could occur in these programs because they have a carbon intensity framework, but they don't. These programs base feedstock emissions off really average practices. And for reasons that we'll get into, but it's really basically, so these programs are also not providing an incentive for climate smart farming practices yet either. Next slide. Right now in the US, the biodiesel and renewable diesel have $1 per gallon tax credits. And the US has made this a big priority to produce clean, sustainable aviation fuels, which we'll hear more about from GEVO. But there's a 40B tax credit that was passed this year. It's for 2023 and 2024. and it's based on if SAF gets at least a 50% CI reduction relative to petroleum jet fuel, then you get $1.25 per gallon credit, and then an additional 1 penny per gallon credit for each percentage point reduction up to $1.75 per gallon. In 2025, the 40B tax credit will go away and it'll be superseded by the 45Z clean fuel production credit. And this is going to go to all forms of clean fuels, and including biodiesel, renewable diesel, and ethanol. And this is also based on a carbon intensity. It's not the exact same formula that's being used for 40B, but it's a similar idea, being that the higher carbon intensity you get, the lower tax credit you get. Still, though, we don't have the rules and the protocols for how these CI scores will work, so it's unclear right now whether climate smart farming will be credited and be allowed to be credited in the way these tax credits are being set up. Next slide, please. One of the climate smart practices that does have a standardized protocol is anaerobic digesters. So this isn't actually a cropping system practice. This is based on livestock farms. It's the idea behind anaerobic digesters is that they're a way of sealing lagoons, and then you capture biogas that would otherwise lead to methane emissions. And so there's an avoided methane emission credit associated with anaerobic digesters, largely because they aren't being widely used. That they've historically been, set up as an offset program, but in recent years, biogas from digesters is being converted to RNG, and which is injected which is being sold at fueling stations for light duty vehicles. And this is, and I'm just going to wrap up here really quickly. The issue of anaerobic digesters is also important for crop-based biofuels because ethanol facilities can lower their carbon intensity in concept by replacing natural gas for industrial heating with renewable natural gas. And so if we go to the next slide, this is just going to show a large spike in credits that has been issued to digesters in clean transportation, California's transportation fuel program, as well as the EPA through the renewable fuel standard. Next slide. This is my last slide. So just to wrap up, I think for the future of biofuels, carbon intensity standards are going to be really important, both for fuels and for non-fuel markets. We've seen offset markets have not developed well for farming practices and for ranching practices over the last several decades because there hasn't been standard protocols developed. And so that'd be something we would want to not see repeated in the context of biofuels. The importance of standardized protocols and quantification methodologies is going to be really important here. One model that has been useful in this regard is maintained by Argonne National Laboratories. It's a model called GREEP, and they have a calculator that can be used for feedstock variation, calculations. And that's a model USDA is looking at, ways of improving and refining GREET so it can be used in that context. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and hand the keys over to the next presenter. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Very informative and very interesting. I want to remind everyone to ask questions, and we'll have ample time to address them, and those that won't be addressed will be addressed later on, and we're happy to have a lively discussion. Now we will be hearing from Madhu Khanna. Madhu, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Gail. Next slide. So as was just mentioned, agriculture has a significant opportunity to help mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, and it can do that through providing biofuels and sustainable aviation fuels that displace fossil fuels, as well as by increasing the amount of carbon that is stored in soils. It can actually be a sink for carbon rather than a source for carbon. However, the way that agriculture is currently being practiced, it is a net source of greenhouse gas emissions, and just row crop agriculture accounts for about 5% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the US and in Europe. So, and this is for various reasons. It is fertilizer intensive, tillage intensive, has been leading to a lot of depletion of soil carbon over the decades. And so it, instead of being a sink, it has been a substantial source of carbon. However, as just mentioned by Jeff, there is significant potential for climate smart practices to reduce this carbon intensity. And this is a recent study which shows, the graph at the top shows how much potential there is to reduce the carbon intensity of corn from the business as usual way to almost get it down 71% through various practices that optimize the amount of fertilizer that is applied, replaces the use of fossil fuels and or liquid fuels with electrification on the farm, redesigns the way that agriculture is conducted, improves crop genetics, and so there's ways to reduce, increase the amount of carbon that is sequestered, as well as reduce the N2O emissions by improving the way that nitrogen is being applied using, say, variable rate, precision farming, and so on. So there's a lot of potential here. And one of the ways, next slide, please. One of the ways to do that is by promoting more what's being called climate smart agricultural practices. And there are various ways to be more climate smart. One is to increase the amount of carbon that is stored in the soil, and this is through practices such as reducing the amount of tillage, planting more cover crops in the winter, managing fallow land better, and the way grazing is conducted. And this is not only beneficial for the soil, but improves, soil carbon, but improves soil health, improves the resilience of the whole farming operation, and can provide a lot of economic benefits in the long run for agriculture as well. The other ways are to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are generated above ground, and that is through in the form of methane, nitrous oxides, and so on. And this can be done through a number of different ways, such as managing feed for livestock, manure, and how much fertilizer and where and when fertilizer is actually applied. Other ways reduce greenhouse gas emissions by improving on-farm energy efficiency, switching more to electrification of equipment. And then there are various ways to also improve forest management and make that a net sink, more of a sink for carbon. Next slide. So this is just one example of why cover crops are important. Currently, about 95% of the US farmland is left bare for 8 months of the year between the time that harvest occurs in the fall for corn or soybeans to the time that they are replanted in the spring. And during that time, there is significant opportunity where they could be sequestering carbon simply by covering the soil with cover crops like rye and winter wheat and so on. And there has been a lot of research now showing that cover crops can increase the amount of soil carbon relative to leaving the soil bare. And although they are not able to fully reverse the overall declining trend in the amount of soil carbon due to farming practices, but they can certainly slow down the rate. So it's about almost 0.3 tons of carbon can be sequestered per hectare per year. And even though that's a small amount, but if we look at the millions of acres of land which are under corn and soybeans, the overall impact can be fairly significant. Next slide, please. So this is a study looking at how these practices can actually lower the carbon intensity of biofuels, in particular looking at corn ethanol. And the left bar, the first bar, shows the carbon intensity of gasoline, which is close to about 100 grams of CO2 per megajoule. And the next bar shows what was the estimated carbon intensity of corn ethanol by the regulatory impact analysis that was done for the Renewable Fuel Standard way back in 2010. Since then, there have been improvements in practices, there have been increases in yield, and so some of this carbon intensity has naturally come down. But the last bar shows that how much they could come down if we were to actually adopt climate smart practices, and through cover cropping, no-till, and so on, we could further reduce the carbon intensity almost by 50% relative to what it is expected to be in 2022. So that's biofuels offer improved practices for biofuels offer a lot of potential for reducing the amount of carbon that is being emitted per megajoule of ethanol produced. Next slide. The challenge, however, is that the adoption rates of these climate smart practices is currently very low, in particular looking at cover crops, despite the fact that there have been numerous conservation programs and payments that have been increasing, as shown by the orange line on the bottom, through the kinds and more programs that Jeff described in his talk in terms of payments for farmers to adopt them. There have been voluntary carbon credit markets that are paying farmers for practices like cover cropping. But despite that, there have been just the adoption rates are less than 10%. The map on the left shows a lot of variability, and particularly in the Midwest, where a lot of the corn and soybeans is grown, there's a lot of potential to increase adoption. There are just numerous barriers to adoption. The costs are higher than what some of these payments have been. There's just a lot of transaction costs for farmers to enroll in programs that pay for adopting cover crops. And there are concerns about potential negative impacts, at least in the early years, on crop yields by doing cover cropping. And just that these the additional risks and the costs of enrolling in programs may not be covering the cost of adopting, and the carbon prices are still not quite at the level that is needed to induce farmers to adopt these practices. Next slide. And so, so the goal is really to look at how we can develop markets for promoting climate smart practices. And Jeff described the Climate Smart Partnerships program that is seeking to develop markets for these commodities and really build in carbon intensity as part of the attributes of these commodities when they're sold on the market. And biofuel policies offers us another opportunity to develop a market that can operate autonomously, without needing conservation payments and government programs and so on, or requiring that a separate market for carbon credits be developed. So these policies allow the carbon to be, the carbon intensity to be integrated with the energy renewable energy component of the biofuel. And they can be substantial because biofuels do utilize a very large portion of corn and soybeans. And so currently we're utilizing about 40% of the corn and 50% of the soybeans. So that's about half the market is being, for these commodities, is coming from biofuels. However, the current biofuel policies do not actually incentivize climate smart practices and reducing the carbon intensity, particularly for sequestering carbon in producing these commodities, corn and soybeans. So for example, the low carbon fuel standard in California and a couple of other states only includes the life cycle emissions, and that's the above ground emissions from feedstock production and this indirect land use change, but does not include the direct below ground emissions reductions. The renewable fuel standard has a threshold, and it provides no financial incentives to lower carbon intensity below that threshold. Next slide. We know that policies like the low carbon fuel standard, which is a performance-based policy directly tied where the implicit payments and the demand for different types of biofuels is directly tied to the performance of the biofuel in terms of its carbon intensity relative to the standard. We know that that is a very effective policy. It has been very successful in more than achieving its target to date of lowering carbon intensity of fuels in California by over 10%. And the map at the bottom shows that, in fact, it's really attracted the lower carbon intensity biofuels to California and created incentives to be more innovative and generate more pathways with lower carbon intensity than in the rest of the country. So these performance-based policies that reward directly the carbon intensity reductions are very effective. The challenge is that having state policies can create these unintended effects of just shuffling biofuel across the country. And so What we ultimately need is more national policies that can provide uniform incentives across the country to lower carbon intensity of biofuels. Next slide, please. So thinking about how we can design biofuel policies to be more climate smart at a national level is a promising way to create the incentives for farmers to adopt more climate smart practices. But there's a number of different challenges that need to be overcome and that we need to think about. The first is we need very credible and low cost technologies to measure and monitor and verify carbon sequestration at a fine spatial resolution at a field scale, and then think about how that is going to be incorporated in the carbon intensity score of the ethanol that is being produced. There are various strategies for doing this using field measurements and models, but those are still in the process of being developed and need to be available and to be adopted in a more widespread way. There are a number of other issues. The first one is how do we avoid leakage of carbon emissions and this indirect land use change? An example would be if cover crops, for example, lower yield of corn in the early years by a small percentage, that can have an impact on corn prices and corn markets and create incentives to expand corn production elsewhere. And so that can lead to some leakage. We want to have policies that are not just focused on biofuels, but also on the food and feed markets, so that there isn't shuffling of corn and soybeans across these markets to take advantage of some practices in some markets, but not available elsewhere. And then the last is to think about ensuring permanence of the carbon sequestered. So we need long-term policies and contracts to ensure that farmers practice these policies for a long enough period to benefit from that, so that the environment benefits from that, and not policies that are being adopted only on an annual basis and then de-adopted. So we'll stop with that. Thanks, Gal.
Thank you very much, Madhu. Very interesting work. Next, we have Kathy, who will talk to us about SAF. Kathy, the floor is yours. You're muted, Kathy. Kathy, you're muted.
There we go. Sorry about that. I was getting ready to click that button. All right. Hopefully I am good to go now. Yeah, no, thank you. I'm with a company called Gevo. If you're not familiar with Gevo, we can go to the next slide and I'll tell you a little bit about some of our lines of business. We are really looking at how we harness agriculture and do that in a beneficial way for renewable fuels, renewable chemicals, in particular focusing on sustainable aviation fuel, looking at building a new production facility for SAF in South Dakota. Again, I'm really looking at how do we really decarbonize that production process from the feedstock all the way to the final fuel. To help us do that, we also have a tool that is available for farmers through our Verity Carbon Solutions that really enables them to track the carbon intensity of their feedstock on a field level basis. And then we also have an RNG business, a dairy digester in Iowa that provides us with an opportunity, to continue to use that for our, to sell that into the RNG market or potentially power one of our facilities. Next slide. Just a little bit more about our initial planned investment in sustainable aviation fuel. We will use an ethanol to jet production process. We are currently in the financing phase of a 65 million gallon facility in Lake Preston, South Dakota. Targeted startup in 2026. Really looking at how do we, purchase that climate smart, low carbon intensity corn feedstock, wind power generation, again, that optional RNG, producing not only those 65 million gallons of SAF, but also a considerable amount of protein as a co-product from that corn, low carbon corn oil that can go into other biofuels. And then another big piece is sequestering the carbon off of that production. Next. Really looking at, I think, overall, the principles of what Gevo works on is this net zero emissions production cycle. Again, taking advantage of that carbon that is consumed and sequestered from photosynthesis, from growing plants, a non-fossil based energy source, sequestering that carbon, again, to really supply those fuel markets, and doing that in a way that has net zero emissions rather than the fossil energy process that continues to increase CO2 emissions. Next. Really, what is that market for SAF? If you're not sort of familiar with the aviation fuel market, in the United States, we use just over 20 billion gallons of aviation fuel, jet fuel per year. Certainly the international market is even larger. Currently for Gevo, we have signed offtake agreements with a number of airlines that you see here, totaling around 400 million gallons per year. Some of those contracts start in 2026, some 27, 28, and go for 5 to 7 years, 3 billion gallons per year. We're seeing a huge amount of demand from airlines for sustainable aviation fuel. Really, if airlines look at how do they reduce their carbon footprint, their most immediate option to do that is by changing their fuel. SAF is a completely drop-in fuel. It works with existing engines, with existing jets on the market. There's not a change required. Current regulations allow for blending of SAF up to 50% with traditional jet fuel. Certainly work being done to ensure that how we can go to those higher blends, but it is currently approved right now up to a 50% drop-in basis for SAF, and really seeing that big demand from airlines. Next. When we look at feedstocks for SAF, corn is certainly not the only one. There are other feedstocks that can be used that are non-carbon, non-fossil-based feedstocks. I think we really look at how we can get the most use out of that land. Land is a limited resource. Therefore, looking at agriculture, at biomass that produces both feed and fuel and protein and oil. So we are getting those multiple uses, looking at how do we make that entire supply chain more sustainable, and how do we incentivize that sustainability. And part of that is measuring and tracking that sustainability through the entire supply chain. Next. When we look at corn on existing acres, because we have this ongoing increase in corn yields, it's kind of due to technology, productivity, a number of other factors. U.S. farmers continue to produce more corn on the same acre footprint of land every year. Each year, that could produce enough additional corn feedstock for about 300 million gallons of SAF and those related protein and oil co-products. So certainly we see a SAF as a great market opportunity for farmers who continue to have higher yields without having to increase that land in production. That yield, those yield improvements help supply that feedstock that we're looking at. Next slide. I won't talk a lot about the existing policies. I think the previous speakers covered these pretty well. Certainly we see the renewable fuel standard having been a big success as a volume-based policy that really helped renewable fuels get that space on the shelf in a market that was controlled by petroleum. That we certainly see a lot of progress with the state low carbon fuel standards, particularly California, which has had that in place the longest. These programs are working. The carbon intensity of fuels is decreasing, and it's really providing an incentive for producers to decrease that carbon intensity. As additional states and perhaps the federal government look at these types of low carbon fuel standard policies, we really believe that these must remain technology neutral and feedstock neutral and account for all of the carbon reductions. I think that's a shortcoming a little bit on the California side. They're not accounting for all of those carbon reductions you're getting from agriculture. So certainly would see that as a way to improve those policies. And then Jeff talked about the new tax credits, which I think are a form of a clean fuel standard, but really sort of exercised through the tax code and rewarding those fuels, providing that incentive based on how low that carbon intensity is. Next slide. I think when you have policy that is based on carbon intensity that performance standard, we really feel like the measuring stick for that policy and how you measure that carbon reduction becomes increasingly important, relying on the science, relying on the data, not relying on the politics. Sometimes easier said than done. We are huge advocates of the Department of Energy's Argonne National Lab GREET model because we believe that GREET has the most tools and the most updated data that allows for counting all of those carbon emissions, whether that is on the agriculture feedstock production side, through the entire fuel production and onward. So currently we do have the federal government through an interagency process working with the Treasury Department, really setting the rules for these new tax incentives. A key piece of that we believe would be the Treasury Department designating GREET as an allowed measuring stick here for both the 40B tax credit for SAF, which we think then really sets a strong precedent for the 45Z credit for clean fuel production, which takes effect in 2025. They're going to use GREET for on-road transportation fuels. It would be wholly consistent then to use GREET for those aviation fuels, which, like Gevo SAF, is derived from ethanol, further processed into SAF. That really allows that consistency in how you're evaluating that carbon reduction through the entire supply chain. Next slide. I guess what does that look like sort of in practice for a fuel producer when we are, putting all of those pieces together, when we are using those tools from GREET, as you can see, you get those additional reductions can account for those additional reductions from ag practices. If you have farmers that are producing those types of feedstocks, that additional carbon reduction from carbon capture, additional carbon reduction from that defossilized energy process and energy supply, and really allows us to get to that net zero fuel. Next slide. Tying this back to the agriculture feedstocks, Jeff mentioned the climate smart commodity grants that USDA has out there. We're very excited to partner with USDA on one of those grants, working with farmers on using our Verity carbon tracking tool. This is sort of what farmers who are using this tool see. It has a variety of input and data sources, again, based on this feedstock carbon intensity calculator that is a tool of GREET that is allowing that measurement and verification of those on-farm practices and how those contribute to reducing the carbon intensity, or determining what is the carbon intensity of that feedstock that is going into that fuel production process. So continuing to use that, partner with USDA on that grant. We have an ethanol producer that we are working with currently in Iowa. They are, farmers that they are sourcing from are using this tool. Planning to use this with our net zero facility in South Dakota, and really looking for opportunities to continue to grow that, that measurement and verification tool for farmers. Next slide. And really just, kind of illustrating here sort of how that works through the entire supply chain. That measurement, that verification to track those sustainability attributes, the feedstock, the fuel production, and ultimately to the end user in the jet, on the aviation side, with the airlines, with the jet fuel. And last slide, I think maybe just to wrap up, I know that was kind of a lot of information very quickly, hopefully sort of help build on, what the previous speakers shared. But, I think we really see this as an opportunity here when you have these policies that are incentivizing these practices on the farm, really contributing to this whole circular economy that is taking carbon out and removing that carbon from that entire supply chain, and really providing that biofuel market such as SAF, which is a growing market, really provides an opportunity with the right policies to reward those farmers on those production practices for the work that they're doing. We hear a lot about carbon offsets. There's certainly a role for that. I think we really take more of an approach, on those carbon incentives. How can we, decarbonize that entire supply chain, add that sustainability throughout the entire system, from the feedstock to the finished fuel, and the policies that help incentivize that. So thank you all very much for letting me, share a little bit about Gevo, and happy to take any questions.